Good morning. It's difficult to follow on from a scintillating session. My name is Partha Mukhopadhyay. I am with the Center for Policy Research. And the purpose of this particular session is twofold. One, to introduce Indian megacity regions to the international audience. And secondly, to start off from where Minister left off and sort of start the process of I'll just wait until this thing is done. The purpose of this session is to introduce Indian megacity regions to colleagues who may not be familiar with it, as well as to hopefully provoke discussions on a proposal that has been advanced in the thematic report referred to by the minister. This particular study that I'm presenting was based on a grant that was given to us by the Ministry for Urban Development with these terms of reference, as you can see. I will not read them out. They are relatively short and quite self-explanatory. This was conducted by a fairly large and multidisciplinary team. Some of the persons on the left-hand side have moved on to other assignments since, but they all contributed in substantial detail to the study. In addition, we were fortunate to have very useful supporting research from the Prayas Energy Group, who did an independent study on electricity in megacities, from the Institute for Financial Management Research in Chennai, which sort of looked through the financial aspects of Chennai, and the Center for Environment and Development in Kolkata, which looked at the wetlands issue in Chennai. And of course, the various officials and the chief executives of the Metropolitan Region Development Authorities, whom we met, and various people in various cities, some of whom are here today. We're grateful for their presence, and even more grateful for their help over the last year or so. The plan of this presentation is we start with a brief introduction, then we look at the characteristics of the regions, the challenges of these megacity regions, how they have responded to it, and then discuss the whole issue of governance of these particular regions. So the governance structure in India essentially, as Mr. Ramkrishnan mentioned during his initial remarks, broken up into the union, state, and local government, but obviously this is an insufficient metric or a measure within which to measure megacity issues. And in addition, a lot of this ground has already been covered, so I'll just sort of move forward on this one. When we talk about megacity regions, I think it's useful for us to understand what we meant in this particular study. The Census of India defines something called an urban agglomeration, which is largely something that is driven by spatial contiguity. Then addition, there is a collection of municipalities that you can sort of put together, and I'll get to more of it in a second. But there's also the whole issue of legislated regions, which are created when states create metropolitan development authorities. When states create these authorities, they also define a region over which that metropolitan development authority will have sway in terms of where their powers will extend to. And it is this notion of a state-defined metropolitan development area that we considered for our study as the metropolitan development region, largely because it is the clearest political expression by the state of something that is understood by them as referring to a region that depends on a core city. So that is the third element, and we'll come to that in a second, is what we are looking forward in that area. The 5 regions that we're looking for in that area are Kolkata, Mumbai, and this is broadly to give you a sense, especially for international participants, to where these cities broadly are. Um, Over the years, and this is in the report, but these regions have had a fairly long history. The first, of course, was the Delhi Development Authority. You then had the MMRDA roughly in 1974. Before that, preceded by Kolkata in 70. So a lot of these regions came into being in the 1970s. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion as to why is that an appropriate time in that area. Of these various regions now, it's only Bangalore which is in the unique position of having two development authorities, one which is the Regional Development Authority and the other which looks at the city, the Bangalore Development Authority. So the Bangalore Metropolitan Region Development Authority, BMRDA, coexists with the Bangalore Development Authority, which looks after the city. In all the other regions, there is a single unified authority which looks at the region. So what are these regions like? I'll go through this fairly quickly. You'll have some basic, these 5 panels to your left, give you some basic information about each of these regions. And for those who are not familiar with the regions, I'd encourage you to they have been made with some love and labor, and I would encourage you to go through them at your leisure. So I'll just move through these areas. Bombay is about 4,500 square kilometers, and as you can see, essentially defined largely by the transport network. Also, the initial rationale for the creation of Bombay came through as part of the commuting distances. And as you can now see, those distances extend to as much as 120 kilometers from the south of Bombay, which is where we are currently, and a slightly more manageable 54 kilometers if you move in the northeasterly direction. Right? So this is, you have a similar kind of spread for Kolkata. The red circles that you see on the right-hand side are sort of the extent of the region as defined by the KMDA Act. Actually, the Town and Country Planning Act, which incorporates the KMDA, which defines the KMDA, but the transport network goes to almost as far as Mumbai, about 120 kilometers or so. Chennai is, in that sense, a slightly more compact city, about 50 kilometers in a semicircular fashion. But Chennai has also got 2 interesting characteristics. One, a lot of the place where growth is taking place in and around Chennai is outside the region, and there has been discussions for expanding, as we shall see later. And in addition, you have a situation where the Chennai urban agglomeration, it is the only one of our 5 mega regions where the urban agglomeration, which as I said earlier, is defined by spatial contiguity and defined by the census, actually is not contained within the metropolitan region. So Chennai urban agglomeration actually extends beyond the Chennai metropolitan region. Bangalore is the only region where there is a neat overlap between districts and the boundaries of the region. It contains 3 districts now: Bangalore Rural, Bangalore Urban, and Ramnagaram. The 3 districts were created out of a single Bangalore district, and therefore, when it was defined, and this was defined in the 70s, it was defined over that entire district. It actually had a little bit of Kolar thrown into it, which it lost like a little appendix somewhere along the way. So you broadly have, Bangalore is the only place which has, in principle, an overlap between the administrative jurisdiction and the regional jurisdiction. And finally, Hyderabad, which is recently, perhaps in this constant tension and competition between Bangalore and Hyderabad, moved to extend its megacity regions from roughly what was about 1,300 square kilometers to 7,100 square kilometers in size, and this happened in 2008. And along with it, it also extended the municipal corporation to about 650 square kilometers, roughly about 5 times what it was before. The shaded area that you see in that region, this is something that could perhaps be discussed, especially in the context of economic development, is called the Outer Ring Road of Hyderabad. As you can see, it sort of bounds the Greater Hyderabad Municipal Corporation. But the more interesting part of the Outer Ring Road story is a planning story. The Outer Ring Road's planning zone is essentially a planning zone with significantly different planning laws and significantly more relaxed in terms of, the minister mentioned FSI during his remarks in the morning. This is one zone where those kinds of restrictions do not apply. And the question is what kind of development would take place is an interesting thing that we shall observe going forward. So that's roughly what the spatial story is. So what are these regions like in demographic, non-political, and cultural character? I think a lot of this has already been referred to by Mr. Shivramakrishnan in his opening remarks, so I'll have the benefit of running through quite quickly. As you can see, these are, sure. I think Mr. Shivramakrishnan mentioned that in the morning, that Delhi is sui generis in its governance structures, and not. So, but in some senses, these are perhaps a place where the tension between the state and the local, which the minister referred to, I think is an even more of an issue. In Delhi, it's quite possible that tension may be between the federal and the state. And now, of course, the state has come back with a fair degree of strength to trifurcate the Delhi local government into three elements. So there is a whole debate around Delhi which one could have. Yes, there was a, no, it was a conscious decision not to include Delhi, in a sense that the structure put together. One of the issues that you would look through in these areas is very simply the fact that if you look at the national structure, our megacities are not overwhelmingly dominant in the system, as you'd find in many other places. So we have a fairly dispersed urban system. You have about, this is about currently 15% of the urban population. If you throw in Delhi, it comes to about 20% of the urban population. You're looking at roughly 6% of the national population if you throw in Delhi. But in each of their states, as you can see from this particular chart, they are very important, especially in terms of the urban population. Apart from Hyderabad and Chennai, Bangalore is roughly about 40%, Kolkata well over 50%, Mumbai about 40% of the urban population of these states. So in their states, these are all what urbanists call prime cities, which means they are at least twice as large as the next city in that particular state. There are also a relatively significant share of the state GDPs, as you can see, except as I said for Chennai and Hyderabad. Tamil Nadu's economic structure is a lot more spread out, and also because of the nature of the Chennai urban agglomeration, it's the way it's defined, it's put together. These numbers that you actually see there and that you shall see in the charts are numbers, as an economist, let me sort of point out, these are numbers in the prices of 1990, and the numbers refer to 2005, because that's the last number for which we have consistent data. One of the issues while doing this study is, as our international collaborators might recognize, we have very little information at the level of the region. So a lot of this has to be constructed in various ways. We've tried to do it in a consistent manner, which will hopefully aid other researchers going forward. But these have to be constructed in some sense. There is no place where you can sort of pull out a number for what is the GDP of a particular mega region. So what you, as a rough ballpark figure, what you need to do is to multiply those numbers by about 4 to get today's GDPs of these cities in today's prices. And if I do that for Mumbai and sort of use a PPP transform that people love to use nowadays, that number comes out to about $250 billion. So the GDP of Mumbai is roughly comparable in PPP terms to the GDP of Hungary. A little bit more than the GDP of Israel. Right? So we're talking about pretty large, heavy economic beasts in this particular area. The blank cells are actually there for a reason. This gives you the share of GDPs by different sectors, and you can see C is manufacturing and G is high-tech services, real estate, business, finance, and that kind of stuff. And both of these, especially Mumbai, Kolkata, and Bangalore, provide a large share of these GDPs. The interesting part of this particular story is that you have a situation where if you look at the national survey data, we really don't have the information to construct these numbers in a disaggregated fashion like we have done. So currently, we are not collecting data in a manner that will help us understand our cities. That's one of the big issues that we need to sort of understand, which is why we've kept the things as a blank. And this gives you a sense of the structure of employment, the structure of GDP within these cities, which means roughly about a quarter of the employment is in manufacturing, and about the same in terms of the GDP structures. And if you look at it, we talk a lot about India not being a manufacturing country and that kind of story, but within our urban areas, and especially our regions, there is actually a fairly significant share of manufacturing. So the question as to whether we are not enough manufacturing, maybe need to sort of step back and think as to whether we're not enough urbanized, and consequently, hence, not enough manufacturing. Mr. Sriramkrishnan mentioned this whole issue of global visibility, and also the issue of political presence, made, I think, of course, emphatically so by the minister in his remarks. The other issue that I'd like to point out to you is the difference in the extent of linguistic diversity across these cities. Bangalore and Bengaluru and Mumbai are two of the more diverse linguistically areas, which means they're drawing in people from all across the country, which you will see in those maps. The map of India that you have in the top right-hand corner of those charts shows you from where people are coming to that particular region. And you'll get a much more disaggregated picture there. This simply gives you, the dark line gives you the share of the largest linguistic group in that particular city, and the shaded line immediately afterwards gives you the share of the next three highest. And as you can see in Mumbai and in Bangalore, the difference between the next three and the top is not very much, whereas in the other cities, of course, they're much more dominant linguistically in specific areas. As far as religious beliefs go, they're roughly in a similar fashion, apart from Chennai, which has a slightly different composition as compared to the other five cities. But each of them extremely, these are, what I would like you to take away from this slide is the fact that as mega regions, they are actually attracting people and serving, in some sense, people across the country. So what are the challenges that these regions are facing? The first is that of administrative multiplicity. As you can see, not only there are districts, municipal corporations, municipalities, and sense of urban administration, but also, as Mr. Sriramkrishnan mentioned, not all that is urban in India is municipal, and therefore there's a significant amount of both villages as well as census towns. Now, census towns are creatures, for those who are unfamiliar with this area, which are villages in administrative terms, but urban in almost every other way. And consequently, I have a colleague, Kanu Pradhan, who has done a very detailed study of those census towns, and if you want to know more about him, please feel free to ask him. But the basic story here is a structure where we're looking at a situation where if at least they are dense, more than 400 people per square kilometer, they are big, at least 5,000 people, and they're almost entirely non-farm, which means 75% of the male working population is, at least 75% of the male working population is involved in non-farm activities. And yet, in some senses, they're governed as if they're villages. Right? So there is an issue here that we need to confront. Over the last intercensal period, their share of the urban population has grown from about 7% to 15%. They have multiplicities of legislations putting this stuff together, multiple providers and regulators of services. We're looking at water supply and sanitation. We've got a long list of acronyms. We'd be happy to sort of spell them out for you. But the general idea is there are a whole bunch of people who are providing, the degree of integration is relatively limited. Multiple planning agencies in these particular areas. And the point that was made by Mr. Sivaramkrishnan, multiple territorialities. There are, even within these mega regions, little carve-outs, areas which are governed either by private parties or by some curious, not entirely by private parties almost in any way, but by a curious mixture of governance arrangements. So, for example, the Navodiganto, which is a small zone in Kolkata carved out of the Kolkata metropolitan area, within the Kolkata metropolitan area is governed by a body which comprises, I think, about 5 businessmen and 5 state government officials, right? So that's so there are innovative governance mechanisms which are playing out in that area. The special economic zones in Gujarat, not an area where we studied, is an area where what you have is a situation where they're going to be governed by a representative of the state government, a representative of the union government, and a representative of the developer. So it's like a three-murti governance structure that you're putting together. Outside of Chennai, for example, the Mahindra World City recently had to hand over the domestic tariff area of that it had developed to the local panchayats for their governance. In other places, the industrial area local authority, for example, in Sri City, which is across the border in Andhra Pradesh, essentially the APIIC, the Andhra Pradesh Industrial Infrastructure Corporation, essentially manages that particular area. So there are different regimes, even in terms of governance, as Mr. Sivaramkrishnan mentioned, experiments that are being carried out in different parts of India. The second challenge, apart from multiplicity, is the competing demand for land. And in India, there's been always this tension between, do we want to contain the city, and therefore this whole belt of a green belt and a border and sort of keep the things inside, or do you want to expand the city? And therefore bring in more land at the peripheries into urbanizable areas. And this tension, I don't think, has been fully resolved. And I think the minister's remarks on land use and the manner in which it is controlled and regulated is, I think, a fairly eloquent description of the problems that we face. One of the results of that is that we take a lot of bypasses. So we take planning for special zones, special planning authorities, special economic zones, transferable development rights, a variety of ways. And I'm sure, Marco is here from Brazil. Mumbai has been one of the key leaders in the transferable development rights. Sao Paulo and other agencies have been used a lot of these development areas, and it'll be useful for them to sort of engage in what the differences there is. But the critical thing is today, MMRDA has, I'm not sure Uma is here, so I'm not sure the numbers are right, but about 12,000 crores in reserves, which is about $3 billion, broadly speaking, $2.5 billion. DDA has somewhere of the orders about $4-5 billion in reserves. These are not necessarily resources that are earmarked for that particular region. And this, I think the minister sort of made this quite clear, so I'm not sort of going to put this thing in much further. The other issue, a challenge that you deal with, is spatial inequity. And as you can see, we use two quick areas, piped sewerage and treated tap water. The first bar, which is the gray bar, essentially shows you the percentage of households who have piped sewerage in the core municipal corporation. So the Hyderabad, let's say in Hyderabad, 82% would have it in the GHMC. In the urban areas of the megacity region, that number drops sharply to 27%. And if you go to the rural areas of that megacity region, that numbers will drop even more sharply to almost nothing. Right? So if it's the same story when you move to treated tap water, with Mumbai standing out as a very strong exception. One of the issues that you may want to think about is Mumbai and its regions is also one place where local bodies have a lot more control over these services. Is this one of the, is the outcome related to that? We didn't explore that issue further, but this is a possible thing to think about as we take this thing further. So how have people responded? How have these megacity regions responded to challenges? The primary response, as we said, is the creation of development authorities. Basically, define a large region, as you will see over there, and give them a certain level of powers. But as we see here, while most of them were conceived in a rational planning mode, and the panel here has Mr. Shirish Patel, who would obviously know a lot more about it than many in the room. So I will not belabor this point, but fundamentally, what started off as an interesting technical solution has got diverted and derailed with a variety of other areas. And part of it, I think, has got to do with the point that the minister made in his remarks, which is the issue of how much participation do you bring into this planning process. Right? Because it is a question of having to be explained to the people, or you have to get them to understand why this is being done rather than wisdom from up high. And that is one of the issues that I think would sort of come through. The regional development authorities, as I mentioned, only Bangalore has two authorities, but each of these areas that we're looking forward is looking to has the development authorities are there in many other cities. The regional development authorities are creatures of these and a few other cities. The composition of these boards is a mix between political representatives and officials as you go forward. And the chairperson is usually a minister of the state government. In a sense, these metropolitan development authorities essentially are vehicles of the state government to manage the area which is in the megacity region. That is one response of the in the megacity. Second response is a boundary expansion, which, and as we spoke about, the boundary of the Bangalore Municipal Corporation, the Brihad, which has now become the Brihad Bengaluru Mahanagar Palike, was increased substantially. Chennai is increased its municipal corporations, now thinking about increasing the region. Hyderabad has done both increases in the region as well as in the municipal corporation. Kolkata, there's been relatively little movement, nor much movement in Mumbai. There has been creation of new municipal corporations in that particular area. And finally, you have a set of what we call sector-specific authorities. These are similar to those from the US, and Amy is on the panel, which are what we call special districts, where different municipalities get together to work on a particular area, but while they might appear so, they actually are not. Because these are essentially agencies created by the state to provide a certain number of services in the municipal corporation. Throughout this response story, as you can see with the development authorities, with the expansion, it's only in the expansion of the boundaries of the local authorities that the local authorities have a certain greater degree of power. And also but the sector-specific agencies means like the water supply and sewerage boards, it means that that function is provided by a state government agency and not by a local authority. This gives you a sense of what that leads to in case of transport in Kolkata. The dark blue is this union government, the light blue is the state government, and the city level agencies are all At the bottom, you see the complexity with which this region has to essentially grapple. And then you have trans-municipal arrangements which bring together different municipalities. The Mumbai megacity region, I think, has the only genuine example of real intermunicipal arrangements, very similar, and this is the similarity to the special districts in the US, where 3 municipalities, the Bhiwandi Nizamabad, Mira Bhayandar, and Thane have come together to manage the Temghar waterworks in the region. If you look at the structure of that management, you'll realize that officials of the state government are actually part of the management structure, but in some sense, the chairman, the controlling structure, is the local body members, which are the 2 mayors, were the co-chairman, the mayor of Thane Municipal Corporation was the chairman. And this we found to be a really interesting, but unfortunately, a very rare, a unique example of management in that during the course of our study. There are other, what we call, we're distinguishing between intermunicipal, where municipalities come together on their own, and multi-municipal, where multiple municipalities are served. Most of the multi-municipal arrangements are done by state government entities, who are projects created for multiple municipalities under the aegis of the Development Authority or Water Supply and Sewerage Board, and something in that structure. The reason for this is fairly simple. Because municipalities do not have agency, they cannot decide for themselves, except in some states like Maharashtra and Gujarat, it's difficult for them to come together to do work or coordinate in a particular manner. We then come to the issue of what is the constitutional status of governance of these particular areas. Mr. Sivaram-Krishnan, who's just stepped out of the room, was involved in the 74th Amendment to the Constitution, which created the Metropolitan Planning Committee, which was the way in which it was constitutionally thought about that these regions would actually be governed. These are the basic features. The elections and the creation of electoral bodies and elected bodies was made mandatory. However, the functions of these elected bodies, what were these bodies once elected to do, that was left as an option to the state governments. So what you have is a situation, and repeated judgments of the judicial system, they have emphasized the primacy of the state authority, and I know Neera is in the room and many others, and they would, of course, refer to the Mumbai Mills case, which I think is the classic case where the primacy of the state government over the local government in deciding what to do with your lands was asserted by the courts. So while it's necessary to hold municipal elections, it's perfectly legal to give them nothing to do. The Metropolitan Planning Committee has, I won't go into the terms of reference, but the fundamental issue that we find is that the composition of this Metropolitan Planning Committee is dominated by municipal representatives. And yet, as we see during the course of the previous discussion, the power and the agency lies outside the municipal domain. So there is this tension between what the Constitution asks you to do and the structure of the body, which says it has to be municipal, and the reality which says the state is powerful, the economy is dependent on global forces. And there's this disconnect or dissonance between what the Constitution prescribes and what the situation is on the ground that I think has led to a situation where the municipal metropolitan planning committees are just not being formed. Or in the case of Maharashtra, where they've actually been formed, the extent of work that they have actually been doing has been relatively limited. Even in Kolkata, where they were functional for about 10 years, because they were, in fact, they were constituted in 2001, again constituted later in 2006, They have not been reconstituted since the left-front government was defeated and the Trinamool Congress has come to power. So out of our 5 megacity regions, 4 of them now do not have metropolitan planning committees, though all of them have passed the legislation to actually form them. Why is that the case? And we mentioned some of that area, but fundamentally, as I said, we go back to this whole issue of the disconnect between what is the situation on the ground and what is the constitutional prescription. And yet, it is hard to get away from the fact that this is among the metropolitan region is constitutionally recognized as part of this particular article. And how do we exploit this recognition? Can we exploit this recognition to provide a certain degree of structure to our system? So the thematic report makes the following suggestion. One, it recognizes the inevitability of metropolitan governance. Right? It also recognizes that it is not possible to keep expanding the core municipality ad infinitum to bring in more and more of the area under the municipal control. Neither is it possible to transfer these areas into the union government, as occasionally people sort of seem to argue. Nor is it possible to separate these out as city-states. Even in Delhi, where it has been a state, the National Capital Region actually sort of now encompasses multiple states. And soon these megacity region will grow out of the state which has been formed, and you can't continually keep on doing state reorganization for that particular area. So how do you then govern these particular regions? One of the issues is to recognize, and since the principal author of this report is Mr. Sivaram-Krishnan, I find this interesting that he also was intimately involved with the creation of the MPC. But he seems to believe at this point in time that this particular design that was created was flawed. And there seems to be little purpose to keep on repeating that mistake over and over again. So the idea is to then remodel the MPC as a metropolitan council, which achieves a balance between the representational legitimacy that I think the MPC currently has in abundance with functional requirements, which means the importance of the state and the importance of business and the importance of civil society in these megacity regions. How do we achieve this? We achieve this by not prescribing the membership of these organizations, but leaving that, in some sense, to the decisions of the states. The idea is to shift from where you've prescribed the membership, but left the functions to the discretion of the state, to a situation where you define the functions and then say, look, if these functions had to be managed, you, the state, decide what kind of stakeholder group you want to bring together to manage them. And it may vary. The political realities of each of our states is different. Different states will have different structures, but it's that shift that we are basically trying to look for. And which is what we are talking about in addition, we think that there should be representation of the union government within this particular structure. And not representation, we can argue that currently of the railways and the structures, et cetera, who are part of the story. That is not the kind of representation that we're looking at. We're looking at political representation of the union government in these areas, essentially recognizing the fact that these regions function not just as for the states in which they are located, but as you see from those charts over there, integral to the development of the nation as a whole. And finally, technically be useful to sort of merge these, or at least achieve some congruence between district administration and the administration of these particular areas. In order to do this, there will be a number of constitutional issues that will come up, but it is possible to do this in the interim through state legislation. So if a state wants to constitute a metropolitan council which sort of reforms the metropolitan development authorities as they currently structure, that is something that is possible through state legislation. And with a much clearer delineation of both the manner in which it will be governed and their functional mandate and the distinction between metropolitan and local tasks. Fundamentally, it's important to realize that the Metropolitan Council should be seen as a part of the state and not as a subordinate entity. It's only then that you can think of it as having a true measure of autonomy. In addition to this, you'd obviously need to provide, if you're going to move some issues down to the local level, you need to provide a lot more authority at the local level. Again, that's an issue that's up for the states to discuss. And it is within their powers to achieve. So that's where I think the thrust of the arguments that we have so far. We look forward to the debate. Thank you.
Partha, thank you very much for a very comprehensive and exhaustive and a very interesting presentation on the challenges that all these mega cities are facing today. In fact, if you really look at it, one must look at not just mega city in terms of the size of population, not just in size of its landmass, where it is spread. But actually, we should really like to look at it that inevitability of cities growing, it has a limitation as well. We cannot just keep making projections about what could be the population of a city in the next few years' time. And therefore, that's going to be the reality which we must accept. It's a need to bring in a lot of planning, a lot of foresight, a lot of vision, and make sure that we don't wait with fait accompli by saying this is the city now, we are giving it to you. So we have messed it up, now manage it. So what cannot be managed in a planned manner can never, and resulted into mismanaged, cannot be managed later on at the end of the pipe treatment like we normally do. So I think we really need to look at it as an issue in which how can we really look at the cities in a different perspective. I think one of the things that we really need to do for each of the city, each of these mega city, is to find out what is the carrying capacity of these cities. This is an extremely important exercise which I think was missing from the point that you mentioned, because each city, each geography, each territory has a carrying capacity. Even if you now make London 10 times of its size, I think London will just crumble, will not be able to take that much load, will not be able to provide the services. And therefore, we really need to first and foremost find out the carrying capacity of each of these cities. And the carrying capacity will depend on several factors. I think one of the things we really need to look at is that city has 20 million population. So where do they get water from? The water comes from thousands of kilometers away. Delhi is trying to get water from Tehri. Mumbai is getting water from Nasik. And all Vaidyanathan, many places. But all these places themselves are facing a crisis because they don't have enough water for their own use. How will we be able to export water to the cities? So I think there are many challenges which are going to come in the next few years' time. Let's take power. Power again is generated somewhere else. To the transmission lines, we are bringing it here. This whole model of whether centralized power generation itself is tenable or not needs to be looked into. So I think when we do the carrying capacity studies of a city, we really need to factor many of these issues into this. How are we going to deal with waste disposal? Do we have enough capacity to do that? And therefore, I think one of the most important issues that really get into is how do you actually make sure that cities' limitations also are understood, and we just don't provide, and we just don't say that this population is going to be so much, and therefore we need to plan. Actually, we need to first find out a limitation of that growth. We cannot just unlimited growth can be built into the cities, and therefore that is one of the most important issues I think that we really need to keep in mind. The second issue is about obviously the quality of life of the cities. You know, the size of population, number of people, how to govern it, all that boils down to for what? Why we need governance structure? I think governance structure is needed to improve quality of life of the people, to increase open spaces there, We cannot just make cities where the cities become slum cities, wherein now Mumbai, more than two-thirds of the population live in slums. I think that's something which is untenable and unacceptable. Therefore, what we'll need to find out is how do you actually make that happen. And then, basically, what is also important is the size of city does not necessarily define the soul of the city. I think each city has its own culture, cultural ethos. How do you actually make sure that that's not compromised in the quest of increasing the size of the city, whether in terms of population or in terms of increasing territorial areas? What is important, most important, is how do you keep the cultural ethos, the soul of the city intact, and therefore that's an extremely important issue. I fully agree that we will need to look at governing these cities in a completely different context. We already have a constitutional framework. The 74th Amendment to the Constitution has provided some part of the solution to this problem, but not entirely agree with you. We really need to find out how can these cities be managed in a manner that there will be one single authority which can plan as well as execute it. In Mumbai, the city that you covered in your study, there are railways who are planning on their own. There's the airport, we decide that what they should do, they will do their own. In fact, even outside the airport, if you want to decide where the car should be parked, I think it will be first, probably before thousands of cars are parked, then somebody will decide who is responsible for deciding on the parking of the car, because that's the type of territorial dispute that exists between various authorities that fight for terrain, fight for their own rights, and therefore we really need to find out one single authority. And that has to be an elected authority, obviously, because we cannot go against the spirit of the Constitution of India. And therefore, 74th Amendment has actually put that particular part of the story very clearly defined, that we need an elected representative, maybe a mayor of Mumbai, who should have exercised many of these rights in many forms. So central government authorities, like railways, like ports, like airports, they need to be subservient in a manner to ensure that the city's planning and execution does not come in the way. As well as the state governments, maybe the city police, in terms of maintaining the order in city, how do you actually make that? It needs to be really looked into. And therefore, I think we really need to look at many of these issues in a different way. You mentioned a very interesting point, and that's the governance issue, that every 10 years, first of all, our policy is that open spaces have to be maintained. So that's the planning. So all the planning authorities of all the cities have provided for certain open spaces. But the open spaces get then encroached by various users. And then the government is extremely intelligent and must be compliment the government for coming out with an amazing imaginative response of regularizing everything. So every 10 years you are going to regularize the wrongdoings of the previous 10 years, then what is the need for a planning? And therefore I think really need to put stop to this, we really need to work on it. Therefore the starting point in my opinion, and I'm sure we have a very distinguished panel like Mr. Shirish Patel, my good friend from media, Mr. Iyer, my friend from Brookings, and I have of course extremely illustrious co-chair in form of Mr. Ram Walse, who is actually putting this into reality, planning new cities and make sure that we don't commit the same mistakes of the old cities. I hope the new cities will be better than the old ones. And therefore all these issues will be handled, but one thing I want to repeat again by saying that what is the whole purpose of relooking and revisiting the issue of governance of the megacity? We should be very clear. The purpose should be how do you improve the quality of life of people who live in these cities? How do you ensure that the open spaces in these cities are maintained much more than what they were available before? If even gardens are going to be taken over for a variety of other uses, I think the city's lungs will be gone. City's ability to deal with any crisis will be gone. And particularly like Mumbai or Kolkata or Chennai, the cities that you talked about, are all the cities on the border of the seas. And the climate change is going to create another set of problems. They are going to say that the sea level rise, hopefully not so soon, but sea level rise will probably even submerge some of these cities. And I'm really shudder to think what would happen for a city like Mumbai and Chennai or even Kolkata with such a population. What is their ability to deal with disaster management? How do you actually they will be able to deal with those issues? And therefore I think these are the many challenges that we are facing here, need to be addressed. And also should not forget the fact that we try to deal with a city, that means we don't have to deal with as a holistic manner. Because where do the people in city come from? If the population of the city is rising, obviously people are migrating from villages into the city. So the village dwellers are now becoming city dwellers. So therefore, we cannot look at only cities' problems, ignoring the reality that we really need to deal with the problems of India as a whole, because if we continue to just address now our attention more on cities, ignoring the reality of villages, probably we'll have the same problem over a period of time. So I think holistic development, holistic planning, and looking into the issues from a human point of view is extremely important. So let me first ask my friend Shirish Patel. I think you are going to look at the settlement issue, so probably how do you look at these issues?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say that since this is a session on the CPR report, I'd just like to make some comments on the report. There are one or two points that I take issue with, and other matters where I agree entirely and wholeheartedly with what the report has to say. So let me start with the issues of contention. At one point in the report, we are told, and I quote, underlying the declared objectives of metropolitan planning, one is to contain the growth and limit the territorial expansion of the core city, and further, stipulation of a green belt. And now, here what I'd like to do is draw your attention to a recent report by Shlomo Angel and others, entitled Making Room for a Planet of Cities, published by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in 2011. This is a study based on satellite images and other maps of a survey of 120 cities around the world. Among the findings is the fact that the built-up area densities in developing countries are double those in Europe and Japan. And the built-up area densities in Europe and Japan are 3 times what they are in the US, Canada, and Australia, the land-rich countries. It's also a fact that built-up area densities declined by 2% per annum between 1990 and 2000, and have been in persistent decline for a century or more. The decline in densities is, among other things, a function of income change. So, to those who think we should intensify our existing densities still further, we should point out that this is exactly contrary to what is going on worldwide. And we would be wise to understand and accept this and plan for the alternative of diminishing densification. While containing a city with a green belt or otherwise might make sense for existing residents and financial institutions that want to maintain. Instead, what we need to do is anticipate and plan intelligently to accommodate the city's inevitable growth. The Shlomo Angel report also notes that cities have fragmented open spaces in and around the city, and the perimeter particularly, that are equivalent in size to the built-up areas. But the size of fragmented open space within the built-up area has slowly but significantly declined in the 1990s. That is, we are losing open spaces for recreation within built-up areas, and I have no doubt that this is partly due to our efforts at containment rather than focusing on expansion to accommodate growth and the diminishing densification that we can expect over time. Incidentally, to those who bemoan the loss of agricultural land to urban uses, we should point out that in India, urban land is between 1% and 2% of the total land area. How much space do we need for urban expansion? What is a realistic projection of Mumbai's urban land needs? And here the findings of the Shlomo Angel study are quite startling. In a developing country with a medium projection of density decline, he expects the urban land cover to increase over a period of 50 years by 326%. And with a high projection of density decline, he expects it to increase by 603%. In other words, in 50 years' time, we should expect Mumbai to be between 4 and 7 times as large as it is today. If that is indeed so, it's high time we started working on a plan to deal with that growth. We also need to get on urgently with planning for Mumbai's growth. As the CPR report says, I quote, opening up new areas of development either left to market forces or handled by development authorities. That's the way it is at present. Now, this is really, in my view, an abdication of responsibility for metropolitan planning. And I think it would be useful to take note of what Angel report says, which is that you should lay out an arterial grid of roads a kilometer apart, which can support public transit. And this is what you should plan for the areas into which the city is going to inevitably grow. Another issue I'd like to look at is housing. Here the CPR report says, Mumbai, even with salaried employment, informal housing remains the only option available for many, end of quote. Now, I think it's a matter of the utmost shame to all of us that something like 55%, I think Mr. Prabhu mentioned 2/3 of Mumbai lives in slums. At the time of independence, 50% of Mumbai lived in rental housing. Since then, in the last 60 odd years, 96% of all new construction has been for ownership and hardly anything for rental. So today we have something like 17% of Mumbai's Pakka housing stock as rental, and that is mainly because of all the old buildings that we have inherited from 60 years ago. New additions to rental stock have been negligible. In cities all over the world, the rental stock is around 50%. In Mumbai, over the last 60 years, we've added 4%. And the reason for this is our completely outmoded Rent Act, which totally discourages the construction of rental housing, particularly for the poor. At the end of World War II, many countries had what we call first-generation rent controls. Every country has either removed these altogether or moved on to second-generation rent controls, by which rentals can be gradually increased until they come close to market levels. As far as I know, Mumbai is the only city in the world that still has first-generation rent controls. Occupants pay 1/1000th of the current market rent. We should understand that rent controls are a form of subsidy extracted from the landlord and paid to the tenant at no cost to government. Government just stands on the sidelines and cheers. Actually, if we were to remove rent control protection from the premises and apply it instead to the occupant, we would find that in many cases, a means test would reveal that the tenant is perfectly capable of paying market rent, and in many cases, the tenant is probably richer than the landlord from whom he is extracting a subsidy. So if we are serious about eradicating slums, we need to move from first generation to second generation rent controls, which means a gradual increase in rentals until they approach market rents, and a complete ban on applying any kind of rent controls to new construction. Only then will we begin to see serious investment in rental housing. In France, for example, 85% of the rental housing is owned by single families who own the home they live in and have a second home which they give out on rent. We can have the same thing here. Families with access to bank loans could massively finance new rental construction for housing. All they need is a cast iron assurance from government that government will not suddenly declare that leave-in license premises are now subject to rent control. The government has done this in the past, in the 1970s. rent control premises were declared as, available for, you could apply to the court and get a fixed standard rent. So as long as the Rent Act is on the books, government can do this again. Only a repeal of the Rent Act or a major modification can be taken as a serious indication that government intends removal of rent control once and for all. On the matter of housing, the CPR report says, I quote, "New attempts to create housing are distinct from the older sites and services programs in the way they are financed." Actually, one of the most successful housing projects in Mumbai, in my view, is Charkop. This is located in northwestern Mumbai. It was started about 30 years ago, and it's a model of mixed income housing with both middle and low income houses ranging in size from 25 square meters to 100 square meters, some on the ground, some in apartments. There are schools and parks common to all. The scheme was completely neutral in regard to financing. There was a small amount of cross-subsidy between the low-income and the middle-income groups, but no external subsidy was required. The original World Bank loan has been repaid in full with interest. After that scheme was over, the World Bank gave up financing such individual projects, but I was astonished that the state government also gave up and failed to recognize that this was a model for future schemes on greenfield sites. It can easily be replicated, and its main feature is affordability, brought about by the fact that for a poor family, the initial investment is minimal, with incremental investment over a period of years as and when the family finds itself in funds. One other possibility that the government needs to seriously consider is inclusionary housing. And policies addressing the problem of housing the poor, all those who are below the median income, exist in many countries. And these are addressed mainly to the 40th percentile and below. That is 80% of those who are below the median income. And this policy exists in England, France, Italy, Spain, Canada, the US, many other countries. The policy simply mandates that whenever you build anything for any purpose, whether it's an office or a mall or a cinema or a high-value residential apartment, you are bound to set aside a proportion of the built-up space for inclusionary housing. In most countries, it's around 25%. In Spain, it is 50%. Most often, the requirement is that the inclusionary housing must be provided on site. So the low-income population is interspersed with the rest of the city. They are not in ghettos at distant locations. Now, the interesting thing is that the cost of construction is reimbursed to the builder. So he's not trying to cut corners on specifications, but the land for the inclusionary housing is free. And it's given, he gives that because he gets permission to develop the rest of the property. It goes without saying that no builder in the world likes his country's policy of inclusionary housing. Now, it's important to understand how these schemes are administered. There are really, it's not left to the developer to manage everything, which is what we do in Mumbai. There are three distinct aspects of such schemes, and each is placed in the hands of the agency best equipped to deal with it. The developer constructs the housing, he understands construction. A separate agency, usually an NGO, in the UK it's typically a housing association, collects rents, maintains and manages the property. It also owns the property, so it's able to mortgage it and get financing. And the third aspect, a separate aspect, is that of subsidy, which is provided by government on a family-by-family basis, separately administered both from the construction and from the maintenance and management of the property. I think it's important to note that no one gets his or her housing free. The family may get a subsidy, but they pay rent or they buy a house from the housing agency that is administering the project. And these agencies are very strongly controlled by government in regard to the rates they can charge. We really badly need this kind of inclusionary housing policy, not only in Mumbai, but in each of the metropolitan regions studied by the CPR. And finally, on metropolitan governance, the CPR report says, I quote, "A metropolitan governance entity should be regarded as an extension of the state, exercising some of its sovereign powers, and not remain a mere creature of the state, subordinate to its different departments." End of quote. Now, it's, in my view, vital that governance of the region is vested in leaders who are locally elected and who are answerable to the city's inhabitants. These leaders do need full powers to be effective. The entire bureaucracy of the city needs to report to them, including the police force. As in New York, the NYPD police commissioner is appointed by the mayor. For the locally elected leadership to be effective, the entire apparatus of bureaucracy at city level must answer to them and not to a state government that is dealing with a host of other major issues of no relevance to the city. The local leadership may report to the state government, but it needs full and independent charge of all metropolitan affairs. Thank you.
Basically, if I look at the problems, I haven't lived in Bombay forever. I've moved to Bombay about 6 months back. I was in Delhi. And in the last 6 months, I must tell you that at least 24 CEOs must have told me that they would rather shift to Delhi. The sense that I get from talking to people across the spectrum is the quality of life, which the chairman talked about, is very critical. And there are several issues to the quality of living. So when I look at governance as an issue, I particularly find a couple of issues which are very interesting. Like, we as media are a mirror to what happens in and around us. So let me just quickly tell you a couple of things which we have reported and we have kind of championed over the last couple of months or even a year. Say, for instance, we talk about governance in city municipal limits. And I look at the first 9 months of the current financial year of the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, and less than 25% of its massive 26,581 crore budget is spent. I'm talking about capital works. Capital works in a city are critical for maintenance of the city, for the running of the city. Clearly, whether this is about, say, containment of the city, or I don't really think it's an issue of containment or expansion of the city. It is more an issue of basic governance at the local level. I look at what the corporators, 227 corporators in Mumbai are talking about in the BMC standing committee meetings, the number of their attendance in the meetings, the issues that are brought out in the meetings, and lo and behold, I'll find that the maximum number of questions which corporators are asking about in Mumbai, mind that they are not about storm drainage system, they are not about slums, they are about renaming of streets and local roads. So when I look at governance, this is something which really strikes me. What are the people whom I elect in my ward, what are they talking about when they are representing me in the decision-making apparatus of the state government or the city? I believe I learned that way back in 2006, a similar debate about rejuvenating the city had started, and the state government did take an initiative to set up an empowered committee. Some of the members of the empowered committee might be there in this August audience. I'm given to understand that this empowered committee met, say, not more than 24 times in the last 6 to 7 years. And the frequency of meetings, which used to be about 3 or 4 or even 5 in a year, has reduced to less than 2 in a year. So this debate about, say, looking at the city and how to take care of the city's problems is not new to Mumbai. It is happening for a long time. And the last point, I don't want to really dwell too much upon it, but one thing which I want to just point out quickly is, to a city or to a state or to a nation, what is very critical is decision making. I have seen that a freeze in decision making, be it the national economic environment or the state economic environment or even the city, really costs. You have seen that in India, a freeze in decision making last 2-3 years. Now I guess things have started moving. Has really cost the government or the country growth in vital GDP percentage points. So do I think about Mumbai. Several decisions take forever to first get off the ground and second to be implemented. Say some of the biggest projects like this Eastern Expressway were to be executed 2 years back. They were started 5 years back, and we are waiting for their completion. Similarly with several other infrastructure projects in the city. So I think the speed to execution starting from conception on paper to decision making to execution, I think that's very critical for cities. And about, say, slums, I really don't see a very concerted effort from the political establishment to look at transforming the city by giving a very good alternative to slums. Many times, many people tell us that, these slums must go. But, you have to include the slum dwellers as stakeholders while we are talking about it. So every other slum rehabilitation or slum redevelopment project has got politicians involved, which I think is critical, but they shouldn't go to the extent of, what eventually happens is a lot of rent seeking in such redevelopment projects. I guess those are issues which the political system needs to really look at much more closely. Thanks.
Hello. First of all, I want to thank Chairman Siva and CPR for giving me an opportunity to join you for this very important conversation. My name is Amy Liu, and I'm the co-director of the Metropolitan Policy Program at Brookings. And prior to Brookings, I had an opportunity to work for the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development at the national government level. I applaud the work the CPR has done on this report. It's a monumental task, unveiling some monumental challenges. And I have learned a lot in reading this report, and you have given us all much to think about. The challenges identified in this report are quite complex, and I warn you that my own early observations will not do this fine work justice. But let me start with several caveats. No doubt, US and India are so different that comparisons are hard to make, and transferable lessons are not so obvious. But I will try to bridge that gap. Now, I love the line in the report that India governance defies typology. We share your pain. The US is also beset, too, with constant problems of coordination, of fragmentation, multiplicity of approaches and systems and institutions. So this is really hard work. But lastly, though, metropolitan city regional governance does remain a work in progress in the United States, and I'm sure elsewhere around the world, and we'll be hearing from other experts on that. So we certainly do not have all the answers. But with that out of the way, let me offer you some three core observations from the American experience. And I would probably say this is the out-of-the-box moment. First, the report calls for the need for a formal definition of metropolitan areas, both as a matter of defining the geography of governance regimes, but also as a tool for standardization when it comes to measurement and statistics. I agree with the importance of this, but I would urge that a metropolitan area not be defined by its human settlement pattern, but by its economic activity. Now, in India, the definition of the metropolitan area is emerging, as the report noted, as a unit defined by planners or by population size and adjacency of population centers. Now, in the United States, our Census Bureau also offers a similar official definition of an urbanized area, which meets minimum thresholds of population levels and population density. But we also are lucky to have a formal, common definition of a metropolitan area that is now used by the Census Bureau, by our Bureau of Economic Analysis, and our Bureau of Labor Statistics. All three of those agencies collect data and share a common definition of a metropolitan area, which is defined by commuting patterns, the extent to which a threshold percentage of workers in an outlying county commutes to jobs in central counties. So at the core, what this means is that we need to look at metropolitan areas through an economic lens. And I think that is absolutely essential and therefore affects the definition of megacity governance and the role and function of regional scale institutions and policies. And earlier this morning, we heard Union Minister Macon imply that can the economic power of metropolitan areas translate to political power? And I think that's something that we need to keep in mind. At the core, cities and metropolitan areas exist because of their economic function. This is also how the CPR report starts with, that cities and metropolitan areas grow and thrive because of economic agglomeration, the inherent benefits found in the concentrations and synergies between firms and labor and in institutions in like industries. Now, I had the pleasure of visiting the Mumbai City Museum yesterday. Mumbai's history begins like all major urban centers. Bombay rose as a major city through its strategic location as a hub of trade and commerce, which was further accelerated by the British East India Company, which strengthened it as a major port city. That growth in trade and commerce spurred the rapid migration of workers who wanted to flock to the city of opportunity. Today, the future and success of Mumbai and other megacities will be its ability to not just manage rapid urbanization, but how urbanization helps it flourish as an inclusive, functioning, and prosperous economy in a dynamic global economy. Mumbai operates as a two-tier formal and informal economy, but it is an economy nonetheless. Land use and planning and infrastructure planning is but one input into what enables markets to work and what enables markets to create opportunities for low-income and working people. Now, one final consideration on this score. We have heard now several times that the 5 megacities featured in this report make up about 10% of the country's GDP. And I think the cities themselves make up about 5 or 6% of the national population. Now, in the United States, the 100 largest metropolitan areas make up just 62% of the national population, but they generate 75% of the nation's GDP. So the hope is that as cities urbanize, they also increase the wealth and productivity for the nation and its citizens. So those economic outcomes must remain central as you determine the goals of improved metro governance. So the second point is, what does this mean then for metropolitan scale governance, and what form should governance take? Now, CPR took about 700 pages to answer this question, so I'm just going to offer some high-level observations on this point. First is that, as mentioned before, we must recognize that a city, a metropolitan area, is a complex market ecosystem made up of highly interrelated subsystems. And now Brookings has had the opportunity to work with metropolitan areas around the United States in creating these regional economic plans to try to operate within these market dynamics. Now, in these plans, leaders are conducting market analyses and strategies around the 5 key market dynamics that drive and affect the key measures of economic prosperity, the measures around GDP growth, around job growth, and ultimately the income growth of our citizens. These 5 market drivers are boosting the growth of your core industry sectors, improving the innovation ecosystem in your economy, developing the human capital and skills of your workforce, infrastructure, land use, housing, and finally governance, the tax and service delivery of that community. These 5 drivers affect the behavior of firms and people and workers. Inherent in that framework is that spatial planning, land use, infrastructure are not ends in themselves. They are means to an end. Ultimately, land use, housing, infrastructure, technology should be physically arrayed in ways that will boost the productivity of firms, the efficient connection between firms, suppliers, and workers, and ultimately include connecting people and neighborhoods to market opportunities. In the end, though, given this context, there is no amount of formal governance that can manage a metro economy or a market system. In the United States, we have created formal metropolitan planning organizations. We have formally elected metropolitan governments, such as in Portland, Oregon, or Minneapolis, St. Paul, which you're going to hear from Myron Orfield tomorrow. We have city-county consolidations to try to match the scale of urbanization and growth. We see multiple cities come together to form formal merged service deliveries to increase efficiencies and save money. We have regional scale civic institutions and nonprofits that try to address regional economic development and other aspects of urban living. We have planning entities. We have project-based implementers. We have fragmented workforce systems. We have fragmented education systems. This is the complex reality of how decision-making and action is being done in our cities and regions. At the end of the day, I think the U.S. prefers an informal versus a formal approach when it comes to regionalism, to embrace the constant government, civic, private sector collaboration with accountability, and to have nimble institutions and policies that can adapt to the ever-changing scale and dynamics that face our regions and our nation. That's the experience at the regional scale. What are the implications for central government? Let me close with what I think remains an experiment today. But ultimately, I think the American story is not one of top-down central solutions by formalizing metropolitan governance. Instead, we are trying to advance flexible approaches to reflect the unique and divergent realities that we're seeing across the various metropolitan areas across the United States. Just like in India, every single one of our cities and metropolitan areas are very different. So to have a fixed response from the central government would not be flexible enough to respond to those tailored situations. Now, when President Obama was elected, there was hope that given his urban roots, he would be good for cities and metropolitan areas. And in that spirit, he created the first ever White House Office of Urban Affairs, and he created a special assistant to the president in domestic policy that was dedicated to urban issues. And we had the opportunity to work closely with the administration in designing a federal approach to metro areas and metro economies. What did this look like? Well, first, metropolitan approaches are not just the responsibility of the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. In fact, some of the boldest metro policies and strategies are driven by the Department of Energy or the Department of Commerce. Then, rather than focus on the form, the goal was to focus on how to break down program silos to reward cross-cutting regional scale decision-making. So in areas of sustainability, how does the Department of Housing, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Transportation, how do they come together to do joint grant making and regulations to promote the integration of these systems to support sustainable outcomes at the metropolitan scale? When it comes to economic strength, the Department of Commerce, the Small Business Administration, the Department of Labor, and many other agencies came together to promote regional cluster solutions on energy innovation, on exports and trade, on advanced manufacturing. Again, all at the regional scales. When it came to economic inclusion, the Department of Housing, the Social Services, the Department of Education came together to create neighborhoods of opportunity. As they did so, they developed performance-based competitive grants to regional consortia of universities, business, civic, and government who can develop strong plans and demonstrate the capacity to implement. At the end of the day, we are rewarding cross-sector collaborations that demonstrate outcomes, and we benchmark their outcomes. And finally, what we're seeing in the last couple years is the federal government and major philanthropies like the Bloomberg Foundation are focused on capacity building. To help cities innovate, our federal government is beginning to recognize that local leadership and capacity matters. So we have interagency federal teams providing technical assistance to cities. We have federal agencies creating partnerships with nonprofit organizations to place young professionals or mid-career professionals as fellows to join city government and help them with design and implementation of strategies. Given severe budget cuts in our fiscal environment in the United States, many of our cities are now strapped for talent. So in closing, there is great experimentation underway in the United States, but the good news is that the US is joining all of you in trying to figure out how we continue to empower cities and metropolitan areas of engines of national economic prosperity and national economic progress. Thank you.
Thank you. I have the difficult job of standing between you and lunch, but it has been made already easier by the previous speaker, so I'll speak as little as possible. To my mind, when we talk about megacity governance, there are three main points. One is planning, the second is implementation, and third is technology. The planning, because a country like India, we will be doubling our urban population by 2030. And that means we will need to build as many more cities as we have today. And what that means is that today we are spending most of our budgets on retrofitting our infrastructure, repairing our services, digging up our cities time and again. And that can be avoided if you plan it properly. The next thing is implementation, and in implementation, if you look at even the report covered the issues in implementation and the urban governance. The main issue that we face today is that we want to decentralize, but we do not have adequate capacities at various levels. So even though we plan, our urban local bodies do not have the capacity to implement projects efficiently and effectively. So that is something needs to be addressed at some point in time. And when we say implementation, there are two things count again. One is accountability, and third is the target-driven or the goal-driven approach. When we are saying that our urban population is going to double in next 20 years, we must have appropriate frameworks and goals set in each and every department of our urban governance. We need to have adequate housing, we need to have adequate utilities, we need to have adequate transportation. And these goals need to be broken down. That's where the accountability and the approach, the capacity comes into picture. And the last point that I would like to make is the technology. Today, we are still talking about how do we accommodate our existing population, how do we retrofit our existing cities, how do we create new cities around our peri-urban areas. Whereas the leading cities in the world today are using technology to their advantage. Talk about Singapore, talk about Barcelona. They are already talking about what their cities will look like with the backbone of technology in 20 years down the line. And it will be very important for us. Our economy is driven by the technology-led businesses. A lot of our IT companies are providing these services to the global cities, but we ourselves are not utilizing these technologies to the best of the effect. And it's high time that we look at each of our mega cities to have a technology master plan where we look at the technologies to enhance the efficiencies of our existing cities. Thank you.
Yes, please. I think probably we'll have just, because at the end of the day, I think there are going to be again, all these panels are going to be discussing. So if anyone of you who is fasting, not going to eat today, can ask question, so that there'll be enough time for.
H.K. Dua, Member of Parliament. I would like to know from Ms. Amy Liu, where does the power of the state administration end and the metropolitan administrations begin? That's the borderline. Where exactly? Similarly, in Washington, where does the power of the federal government ends and the local authorities, how that is area as Washington DC is managed? This is important in view of there is overlap here in functions of the state government and the local municipalities. In Delhi, there is a federal government, we call it central government, state administration, and the local municipal administration. There's a lot of confusion there, too many agencies, as it has been pointed out by Mr. Suresh, Prabhu, down the line. Now, how do you manage that kind of relationship?
I think we'll just collect some more questions, please. Yeah.
Hello. Can I? Can I? Yeah, I'm Ashank Desai, Mastech in Mumbai first. I have a question to Partha. You showed this data there of MMR migration and its impact on how many people speak the language there of that region and how many are non, which was interesting. I saw it for the first time. What would be interesting, or whether you have that data, see this non-local language analysis happens because of migrations of two kinds. People who come from lower income strata and higher income strata both come for a different reason, not in terms of, they come for job, but the different types of jobs. Do you have any data on that which says, that would be very interesting outcome in terms of planning and migration issues?
Yeah, I'm Abhay Pete, I teach economics. There are two queries that I have. One has to do with the CPR report. Has it at all considered the polycentric mode of governance and has for some reason discarded it and is coming closer to the Mumbai vision kind of coordinated CEO model? And the second one has to do and is to do with is, do you really believe, and there were elements of that in what Amy talked of and so on, given the way in which the planning is practiced, especially in the South, is it now the time to fundamentally rethink the planning process and not keep it just to spatial and resources, public resources, but to make it more strategic and policy reform oriented?
I need to make a small clarification. Mr. Iyer mentioned that the Empowered Committee meets only twice or thrice a year. I've been attending it for the last little over a year. We meet every month, Mr. Iyer. The twice or thrice happened in the early years, I believe, but now we meet every month.
Yeah, my question is to Mr. Emilio. You spoke about spatial planning, or rather private sector collaboration with accountability. This is a very important but a very difficult aspect to handle. In India now we are trying to promote more on PPPs. But accountability, even within the government sector, it's not properly established. We are still struggling with it. I mean, what sort of mechanisms do you have in the United States to ensure accountability in this sort of public-private collaboration?
I would request, starting with Mr. Ram, because I hope the cities become Ram Rajya one day. But I'll start with him and then end with Partha. But just few points. Can we think about a charter? We talk about giving more powers under the Constitution, the part of a devolution. Because powers you can give under the Constitution to the lower governments, actually it is at the expense of the higher government. You devolve more powers from central government to state or from state to the local authorities, because that's the only power available within the country. But what is more important is, in addition to devolution of power, can we think about a charter in which, with attendant powers, with attendant ability to deal with all the challenges, it will be responsibility on the part of the city governments to ensure that each of those parameters on which we should judge the performance of that particular government are also fulfilled. Because then that only makes sense, because otherwise, as we are seeing, that we are just going from one end to another, pendulum is swinging from centralized power to decentralized power. But at the end of the day, unless we ensure that the citizens of that particular city benefit from this, it's not going to work. So can we think about a charter for this? So please, Ram, I start with you, not this question, I'm just talking whatever was concerning you, then you, and then we can end with you.
I think there was one question about PPP and accountability. I think in almost all sectors of the economy, we have seen that the PPP has been able to bring in investment efficiency. And there is no reason why in this sector it cannot be. As far as, I think the question was addressed to her, but in US, they don't have too much of PPP, especially in this sector. That's my understanding. However, I think the accountability, see, we are talking about decentralization of implementation mechanisms. And that is also happening because we do not have adequate feedbacks going back from public. That's why we think if we devolve the power to the lowest urban local body, then it helps us in implementing the project better. But which is not the case. If you improve our feedback mechanism from people, and if you still keep the implementation at the higher levels, it will bring in a lot more efficiency to the implementation. That's my view. Thank you.
Okay. Two questions were directed at me. One was about the proper role of federal, state, and local, and the other one about P3s. Let me take the easier one and come back to this very good question about the division of labor between each level of governing. My colleagues write here that the United States does not have a lot of P3s right now in the United States, but we're also recognizing that between the need for private investment in infrastructure, as well as the rise in foreign investment and foreign direct investment in both firms and infrastructure in the United States, that we need to get ahead of the game on this one. So what we're, states and cities are trying to experiment with different forms of privatization and private investment in their infrastructure. What we're finding comes back to this question of capacity. There's not a lot of expertise at the national, state, or local level about how to structure P3s in a way that will ensure accountability to the public and ensure accountability and performance in their outcomes. That expertise is very few and far between. So what we have proposed, both, which is under discussion at the national level, is something that we see in other countries, is whether or not there's a national level public-private unit that works directly with states and cities with a standard approach on how to structure these deals in a way that is optimal both for the market side but also optimal for taxpayers. And we see some states beginning to do that as well. On federalism, our program thinks about this constantly, the proper role of federal, state, and local governments in managing all the complex issues that face our country. And so I think this is always imperfect. There are swings through the political period in history around the level of agency, the local level, and the national level. But here's generally how it sorts out. The federal government obviously is responsible for managing and setting the framework for the U.S. economy and the welfare, social welfare and distribution effects of our society. What's really interesting is since the recession, there has been a real understanding that macroeconomic policies have not been sufficient in helping our very disparate economies rebuild and rebound. What ails Detroit, which is an auto manufacturing sector, is radically different from what is holding back the recovery of a place like Phoenix or Florida, which has mostly been hit hard by the housing collapse. Very different circumstances, not one size fits all approach. So what's been very interesting is we are seeing that our national government is starting to recognize that macroeconomic policies need to be matched with regional economic solutions that enable each of the individual market conditions to adapt to their market conditions, which is why one of the things that we're seeing happening, whether through all the different government funds that comes from federal government, is a reevaluation of formula grants. They're just sending out money to states and localities with no strings attached based on population formulas, but instead now starting to think about giving away grants and federal government funds through competition and rewarding those states, those regions that are willing to make structural, systemic reforms that are going to make a real systemic difference in performance outcomes. So you see our federal government giving massive grants to states who overhaul their education system. You see, as I mentioned earlier, our federal spending going down to regions and rewarding those folks who are solving some of the major challenges the national government faces. The states, though, is where the most power resides when it comes to metropolitan issues. They govern, ultimately, how economic development dollars are spent, how infrastructure dollars are spent, how workforce and education dollars are spent. But what's interesting is, like here, they tend to focus more on the rural areas than the urban. And in that way, they spend more time helping the rural areas where there's not a lot of capacity. So what you're seeing now is states giving more flexible funds to urban areas. When they have very little, anyway, we're seeing a lot of interesting experimentation at the state level, where they are similarly doing what the federal government is doing, which is rewarding large urban centers that come together, reach regional plans, and funding that sort of cross-sector collaboration. But we are seeing in the United States much more collaboration between the states and regions in coming together around the large challenges.
CPR report that PPP brings no new resources to the table. That's an important observation.
I'll give it back to Amy to answer to Mr. Dua's question on governance of Washington, D.C. But on the question of migrants, the current data does not allow us to tell you migrants and non-migrants. We can discover what their occupation patterns are. But migrants from Bihar and migrants from Bangalore, can we discover, separate out their occupation patterns? No. As of now, the current data that's released doesn't allow us to do that. It's possible that if you release these national sample surveys don't allow us to do that. The census data, if it is released even in sample form, might enable us to do that. But as of now, we can only tell you what the difference is between migrants and non-migrants, and that I'm happy to do offline. Yes, I mean, so between generic non-migrants and migrants, we can make that difference.
Sure. For your further studies.
Sure.
I think you are all setting agenda for him to go more into detail. So that's a very good idea. And I think therefore we are going to keep him very busy for the next few weeks or months maybe. So I think till then, I think we can do a better thing for a while, go and break for lunch. And I think we should be back within an hour's time. Thank you very much.